jointly with Yafeng. I'll talk about the first two sections, and then Yafeng will deal with the next two sections. What I'll do is I'll give a brief introduction to our view of evidential pluralism, and then I will talk about how this can be applied to the social sciences. And then Yafeng will deal with two objections to the idea that evidential pluralism can be applied to the social sciences in section 3 and section 4 respectively. Okay, so first of all, a very brief introduction to evidential pluralism. The penguins might look random, but they're not. The penguins and their ramp will reappear later, so do keep them in mind. Okay, so evidential pluralism is meant to be an account of the epistemology of causality. And for a long time, we've realized that correlation isn't sufficient for causation. You need to do more than establish correlation in order to establish causation. This is for a number of reasons. First of all, there are lots of explanations, possible explanations of a correlation between A and B, only one of which is causation. So there might be reverse causation, B being a cause of A, various forms of bias, such as confounding, performance bias, or detection bias that are responsible for the correlation you've observed. There may be certain statistical explanations of the correlation. It's just sheer coincidence, or you've been measuring so many outcomes that you're bound to find some correlation. Or it may be that you've got a correlation due to independent time series increasing trends in both variables. Or there may be non-causal relationships that are responsible for the correlation. Your variables may be semantically related. They might be related constitutively, or they might be related due to logical relationships, physical laws, and mathematical relationships. It's important not to underestimate these other kinds of relationships being responsible for correlations. They often are in a modeling environment. So correlation is not causation. That's the key problem. And we need to ask, what more do you need than correlation in order to infer causation? Well, one view is that if it's genuinely the case that A is a cause of B, then there's got to be some complex of mechanisms that explains instances of B by invoking instances of A, and that can account for the magnitude of the observed correlation. So this is what's distinctive about causality, that you have some underlying complex of mechanisms that gives rise to the causal relationship, and you don't have this underlying complex in the case of various sorts of bias and confounding and so on. So the view is that in order to establish causation, you need to establish both that you have an appropriate correlation between your variables and that there is some appropriate mechanism that can explain that correlation. So the view is that the mechanism is the sort of missing link between correlation and causation. So what we call evidential pluralism, and different people might take different views as to what evidential pluralism is, but what we call evidential pluralism can be represented by this picture. So what you're ultimately trying to demonstrate is that A is a cause of B. And as we've just seen, it's not enough to demonstrate correlation. You also need to demonstrate the existence of a mechanism linking A to B. How do you demonstrate these two things? Well, we're particularly interested in two sorts of study. Association studies on the one hand, which measure A and B, repeated instances of A and B together, perhaps with potentially confounding variables. And these include experimental studies, randomized controlled trials, observational studies, cohort studies, and so on, that include repeated measurements of A and B in a particular population. And association studies are obviously going to be very good at demonstrating correlation. If they're well conducted and high enough quality, they can also provide indirect evidence along this channel C2 that there's a mechanism linking A to B. So for example, lots of well conducted randomized controlled trials can reduce the chance of confounding, and so can help you infer that the correlation that you found, there must be some underlying mechanism linking A and B responsible for the correlation, and that in turn helps you infer causation. There's another way of supporting the existence of the mechanism, and this is to hypothesize specific features of the mechanism complex and then confirm the existence of these features by mechanistic studies. And mechanistic studies look for evidence of underlying features of mechanisms, such as intermediary variables, entities, activities, and organization of the mechanism. So mechanistic studies are usually doing rather a different thing to association studies. They're looking at features of the underlying mechanisms. And so we've got this situation at the moment where present-day evidence-based medicine tends to focus on association studies, like particularly randomized controlled trials. And evidence-based medicine takes mechanistic studies to be strictly inferior to association studies, as we'll see shortly. And this has had an influence on evidence-based policy and evidence-based practice in the social sciences. What we call evidential pluralism takes these mechanistic channels of confirmation to be important too. And our view is that it's important to consider mechanistic studies alongside association studies when evaluating causation. And in the medical arena, this has led to a view called EBM+, which is a development of EBM that also takes mechanistic studies into account when assessing causation in medicine. Here is an evidence hierarchy that's used for the training of students on EBM in the American system. And this is just an example to show that EBM favors association studies over mechanistic studies. So you've got RCTs, cohort studies, case control studies. You've got a lot of different kinds of association study. These are viewed as the higher quality studies. Then you have ideas, editorials, and opinions. And below kind of mere opinion, you have animal research and test tube research, which are often origins of mechanistic studies. So mechanistic studies are viewed as really low quality. So with evidential pluralism, the view is that association and mechanistic studies have complementary strengths. As we've seen, association studies can be unreliable indicators of causality because of biases and so on. And mechanistic studies help to isolate those correlations that are genuinely causal. On the other hand, mechanistic studies on their own have certain defects. Often you can get different mechanisms linking cause and effect. One mechanism may counteract the other and mask the effect of the other. And it can be difficult to work out what's going to happen overall in the mechanism complex. Mechanism complexes are also often very complex, and that can also make it hard to work out what's going to happen overall between A and B. And here association studies help to isolate those mechanisms that actually make a difference, where there's some net effect across the whole complex. So association and mechanistic studies reinforce one another. Their combined evidential value is more than the sum of the parts. Each on their own has various defects, and the other helps to eliminate those defects. So the analogy here, going back to the penguin ramps, is with reinforced concrete. So concrete on its own is very strong in the dealing with forces due to pressure. Steel is very strong in dealing with forces due to torsion. Put them together and you have something that is more than the sum of the parts. Reinforced concrete is strong in a number of respects and is used very widely in construction. And the analogy here is between association studies and mechanistic studies that make up for each other's defects and have complementary strengths. Here's a handbook on EBM+, just a quick note that you can download this free if you're interested in evidential pluralism in medicine. Okay, so how does my evidential pluralism apply to the social sciences? Well, the most obvious application area is going to be evidence-based policy. This is because the lessons of evidence-based medicine spread very quickly to the social sciences and evidence-based policy in the 1990s. So various structures for evaluating policies were modeled on the basis of structures for evaluating medical interventions. For example, in the UK, we have various What Works centres. These are centres for evaluating policies in health and social care, educational achievement, intervention, early years intervention, local economic growth, quality of life for older people, well-being and crime reduction. And these are explicitly modelled on the evidence-based medicine approach. In order to be a What Works centre, you have to buy into the hierarchy of evidence that is perpetuated by evidence-based medicine. And the UK government has an advisory committee on evidence. In order to give advice on this committee, you have to buy into this standard EBM view. The worry is, if the standard EBM view is wrong, then because it underestimates the value of mechanistic studies, then this defect is spreading to the social science as well in evidence-based policy. So if EBM plus methods are worth pursuing in medicine, then they're also worth pursuing in the social sciences. In the social sciences, we're of course more interested in social and behavioral mechanisms. And it's long been recognized that extrapolation of a policy intervention from one population to another, for example, for this, evidence of mechanisms is crucially important. Only if the mechanisms in the target population are sufficiently similar to those in the source population will extrapolation be viable. And a number of existing techniques for mechanism evaluation in the social sciences, one of which is process tracing, another is contribution analysis. And these can all be applied within the framework of evidential pluralism as techniques for evaluating those M channels on the picture I showed you earlier. I just want to briefly note that one of the What Works centres is investigating realist evaluation as an alternative to the standard evidence-based view to evaluation. Realist evaluation is based on literature of critical realism, and this does look at mechanisms. So it's an alternative approach that also values mechanisms. But there are various differences between the realist evaluation approach and that of evidential pluralism. First of all, realist evaluation is realist. There's a commitment to causal powers. Evidential pluralism is a purely epistemological theory and doesn't make any specific metaphysical commitment about causation. Realist evaluation completely rejects the experimental methodology that underpins randomized controlled trials, whereas evidential pluralism takes RCTs to provide good evidence but just says that you need to take extra things into account, namely mechanistic studies, when you're performing your evaluation. Realist evaluation thinks there's no logic of evaluation, whereas evidential pluralism holds that there is, and it's embodied by the picture I showed earlier, the diagram that shows the roles of mechanistic studies and association studies. So evidence-based policy is one area in which evidential pluralism might be applied. Another is to basic social science research. So the idea is that evidential pluralism applies to all causal claims, not just claims about the effects of interventions, like policy interventions. Basic social science research is interested in determining causal relationships in mechanisms that explain social phenomena. And so the epistemology of causality applies equally there too. And if evidential pluralism is a good way of understanding the epistemology of causality, then it should be a good way also of understanding causality in basic social science research. And our claim is that evidential pluralism can help understanding of episodes of social science research and help designers, help researchers to design studies and evaluate their results. I'll just skip over an example and move on to the third area of application, which is mixed methods research. So mixed methods research has become very popular in the social sciences recently. The worry is that there are no clear philosophical foundations for mixed methods research. You tend to have a variety of philosophies invoked to motivate particular social science methods. For example, positivism, relativism, constructivism, and so on. These philosophies tend to be mutually incompatible. And mixed methods research argues that you need to consider both quantitative and qualitative studies. If quantitative studies are motivated by positivism and qualitative studies are motivated by constructivism or pragmatism, then the worry is that you're going to have conflicting underlying philosophies. And it's hard to see how coherent philosophical foundations can be provided for mixed method research. We would suggest that evidential pluralism provides a new way of thinking about mixed methods research. It motivates considering both association studies and mechanistic studies. Association studies are usually quantitative, although they can involve qualitative variables and non-numerical data. Mechanistic studies can be quantitative or qualitative in the social sciences. If we're right, and you need to consider both association studies and mechanistic studies, then as a consequence, you're going to need to consider both quantitative and qualitative studies. So you're going to need a mixed methods approach in order to properly assess causality, because often the association studies and mechanistic studies will contain a mixture of quantitative and qualitative studies. So it provides, evidential pluralism provides a means to argue in favor of mixed methods research. You need a mixed methods approach if you're to properly evaluate both mechanistic and association studies. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Yafeng, who's going to deal with a couple of potential objections to this approach.
Thank you, John. So just share my screen. Okay. So, yes. Okay, so now I would like to address two types of objections to evidential pluralism. One is what we call the problem of sufficiency, and the other is what we call the problem of necessity. One way to object evidential pluralism is to criticize that establishing correlation and mechanism is sufficient to establish causality. For example, like Julian Rice adopted this strategy. He employs a hypothetical example. Suppose so we have some association studies and to already establish a correlation between watching violent TV and violent behavior. And on the other hand, we also have some correlation evidence to show there is a correlation between watching violent TV and, sorry, that's a slide. So watching the violent TV and violent behavior. Given that, according to the evidential pluralism, we can conclude that we have good evidence to show there's a correlation between watching violent TV and violent behavior. However, this conclusion might be problematic according to Julian, because it can be a scenario in which there is a masking mechanism, reducing the possibility or relation between watching violent TV and violent behavior. So in that case, watching violent TV is not a cause of violent behavior. In other words, evidential pluralism is problematic. In response, we wish to put 3 points. The first one is evidential pluralism requires establishing correlation, which is conditional on potential confounders, not unconditional correlation. Therefore, in this hypothetical example, correlation in the appropriate sense is not established because there are other potential confounders. For example, like say, socioeconomic status as an obvious potential confounder is not taken into consideration. Second, as we have emphasized in section 1, as John just emphasized, one needs to establish the complex of mechanism linking the cause to the effect. It is not enough just consider a single pathway of action. One needs to rule out masking mechanism. And in this case, we didn't rule out the psychological mechanism as a masking mechanism. And a third point is, evidential pluralism is an account of the epistemology of causation. It is not an analysis of the metaphysics of causation. If it were analysis of causation in the form of A causes B, if and only if A and B are appropriately correlated and linked by an appropriate mechanism complex, then a single hypothetical counterexample will refute it. But the problem is, evidential pluralism is an account about how to assess causal claims rather than the analysis of the metaphysical nature of causality. In that sense, establishing a causal claim is a fallible activity rather than one might sometimes be mistaken about whether A causes B. Does not refute the thesis that the best method for establishing that A causes B requires establishing that A and B are correlated and linked by an appropriate mechanism. And there is another objection to the necessity of the correlation evidence. For example, Clave challenged that claim. He considered a case study to do with employment and argued that the following causal claim was established without establishing correlation. the causal claim is the strictness of unemployment benefit eligibility reduces the unemployment rate. Clave suggests that there is a consensus among the economists that a monitoring and sanction systems for unemployment benefits has a powerful effect on the unemployment rate. There are a lot of evidence studies show that benefit sanctions induce a sharp increase in the exit rate from unemployment to employment across countries. In other words, the strictness of unemployment benefits eligibility is a negative cause of the unemployment rate across countries. Clave's argument is based on two premises. One, there's no universal quantitative measure of the strictness of monitoring and sanctions. Premise two, there's only mechanistic evidence for the causal claim. Because of this, that there's no universal quantitative measure of the strictness across countries, Clave argues that a correlation between the strictness of monitoring sanctions and the unemployment rate across country is difficult to establish, right? And just because there is only mechanistic evidence, so it seems like we can conclude establishing a correlation is not required to establish a causal claim. We resist this conclusion in two different ways. First, we can see from this example, there was good evidence of correlation. Of course, there was no good universal measure of strictness of sanctions available. That does not imply the strictness of unemployment of sanctions is unmeasurable, and there's no way of establishing correlation. This does not eliminate the possibility of a good measure of strictness in each particular country, even if a good universal measure is not at hand. Moreover, local measures of strictness of unemployment benefit eligibility does not eliminate the possibility of a good measure of that strictness in each particular country. For example, there are some studies show in Netherlands, the imposition of a particular sanction, namely additional job search assistance, is significantly positively associated with the transition rate from failure to work. And also in Switzerland, we can see quite a few studies show that a warning about benefits reduction is positively correlated with the transition rate. So these studies provide useful evidence of correlation between the unemployment rate and the strictness of unemployment benefits across the Netherlands and Switzerland. So in this way, a correlation can be established across countries, even if there's no universal way, the quantitative way to measure the strictness of the benefits eligibility. Second, in this case, we argue that the mechanistic evidence was not enough on its own to establish causation generally. At best, the existence of a mechanism from benefit sanctions to employment was established in the United States, United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Switzerland. More will need to be done to establish a more general mechanistic claim that holds more widely across countries. So, contrary to Clave, the claim that the strictness of unemployment benefit eligibility reduces the unemployment rate across the countries have not been universally established. Okay, so here's some quick recap of our argument today. First of all, in a nutshell, we just argue that evidential pluralism can be fruitfully applied to the social sciences in three significant ways. Firstly, evidential pluralism can provide a methodology for evidence-based policy and can provide an account of the structure, conformatory relationships in basic social science research. And we also just suggested that evidential pluralism can provide metaphysics-free foundations for mixed method research. And we also just try to ward off some potential objections to the application of evidential pluralism to the social sciences. Finally, I would like to highlight one more thing, that is evidential pluralism is a normative thesis rather than a descriptive thesis. Of course, we maintain good practices or good episodes of social sciences do conform to evidential pluralism, but just bear in mind, we are not trying to argue that every actual assessment of a causal claim in the social sciences can be rationally reconstructed as conforming to evidential pluralism. Okay, so that's it.